This is a conversation with Jakub Jajcay. Jakub has a very unique experience and perspective. He served in several elite units in the Slovak military, and once the Ukraine war started, he volunteered and joined the Ukrainian military, serving as an infantry soldier and later in a drone unit on several combat tours. And today he uses his own experiences from combat in Ukraine to draw analytical insights about the war itself, about the changing character of warfare, or about the lessons that NATO should be learning from it. The combination of his highly analytical mind and experience is quite special, and it makes for a very rare and fascinating conversation. We talk about why he thinks that FPV drones are overrated, as someone who actually worked with them, how the reality of war differs from the media perception, and what misconceptions most analysts have about what the war looks like, and about what's the real level of quality of both Ukrainian and Russian military, how would a typical NATO military perform if it was forced to fight in Ukraine against Russia, the real reason for why the Ukrainian big counteroffensive in 2023 failed, and much, much more. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful, and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes, and additional bonus content. And if you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, I also write a newsletter, where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you have quite a unique experience and quite a unique perspective on what we want to talk about. Since you've served in a NATO military, you've served as a volunteer in the Ukraine war, and on top of that, you have a very analytical mind, and you're able to think about your personal experiences and then draw bigger, broader lessons about warfare and the war and military and the military art in general. And I think it's a very unique and rare combination. And there's a lot of different things that I want to talk with you about, and I'd love to hear your opinion on. But I think it makes sense by introducing you a little bit and start talking a little bit about who you are, what did you do before the Ukraine war, how did you end up in Ukraine, and what were you actually doing there?
Thank you for that very kind introduction. So my name is Jakub Jajcay. I served as an officer in the armed forces of the Slovak Republic before the Ukraine war. And around 2017, I sort of had this premonition that, the operations in Afghanistan, the operations in Iraq and Mali were winding down. And it seemed like NATO militaries weren't going to be employed in any live operations for the foreseeable future. So around that time, I decided to leave the military and go to graduate school to get a PhD. And while I was working on my PhD, the Ukraine war started. And when the Ukraine war started, I had this feeling that as a former military officer, as a military professional, this was kind of the thing that I had been training for and preparing for my entire life. If there was ever in my lifetime going to be a situation where I needed to put what I knew to practical use, this was probably that moment. So I decided to join the Ukrainian Armed Forces as an international volunteer. I did 3 tours or stints in Ukraine. The first 2, I worked as an infantryman, as a rifleman in a regular infantry battalion of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The third time around, I joined specifically to be part of a drone team, an FPV attack drone team. And I spent 6 months working with the drone team. So that's the long and short of my military experience and my experience in the Ukraine war.
Do you mind sharing what unit you served in the Slovak military? Or if not, then what kind of a role or position you had, what kind of training maybe you had from your previous military experience?
In Slovakia, I was an officer, so I commanded a certain number of people. I served in a couple of, let's say, elite units in the Slovakian military. And I did a number of things, including, the usual military skill set. So, tactics, shooting, that kind of stuff.
How useful or how relevant and applicable were actually the skills that you've learned in the Slovak military, which, trains and practices and does things according to NATO standards, so quite similarly as other NATO militaries. How applicable and useful all of that was when you then went to Ukraine and you found yourself in the kind of war that NATO militaries have never really fought, and also a very different war than what we've seen ever before.
Well, I would still say that the NATO standard training is very useful for a number of reasons. The fundamental reason is that NATO training is kind of designed to give you something that I call tactical literacy. So it gives you certain basic tactical skills that apply in any kind of war, and they're still applicable in the Ukraine conflict, even with the proliferation of drones, even with the overall strategic situation where it's a war with a clearly defined front line. All of that, simple things like how to move on the battlefield, even more fundamental things like basic weapons handling, marksmanship, all of that is very relevant, and that's something that NATO militaries have spent a lot of time and effort perfecting, and it came in very useful in the Ukraine conflict.
So you're actually the first person that I'm talking to directly who has direct combat experience from the Ukraine war. I usually talk to people who think about it and write about it and analyze it, but externally who haven't had a direct exposure. And as someone who actually fought in the war, do you know, or in your view, what are the most common or most important misconceptions that people have about the war? Even people who follow it quite closely, but who don't have the same first-hand experience that you have. What are the things that people often think about the war that, as a soldier, you know that actually is not true, or it looks differently than what people assume?
So before I say what I'm going to say in answer to your question, let me make a little disclaimer here, in that what I'm going to say is going to be very critical. It's going to be critical of the Ukrainian side of the conflict, but I'm not criticizing the Ukrainian side because I don't support them. Quite the opposite. My position on the Ukraine war is quite clear. I've always supported Ukraine. I continue to support Ukraine, but when I'm critical of the Ukrainian side, it's intended as constructive criticism, and it's intended to be it's intended to stimulate learning on the part of anybody who might be listening to this podcast, including personnel from NATO militaries or at the NATO security establishment. So my criticism is not meant in any kind of bad way. That said, when people ask me what's the difference between the Ukraine war as it's portrayed in the media and the reality on the ground, I sort of make this analogy where I say, in the media, the Ukraine war is portrayed as a professional level MMA cage fight between two professional level MMA fighters. And the reality on the ground is that it's a playground fight between two 4-year-old children. Not in terms of the stakes, but in terms of the levels and capabilities of the combatants. So when you follow the war in the media, you see a lot of high-end weapon systems. You get this narrative that kind of makes sense of what's going on in sort of a strategic way. The reality is that the war is very chaotic. In a lot of cases, both sides, this is not just about the Ukrainian side, both sides, it seems that they're kind of very unfocused. The unfortunately, the level of the quality of the personnel oftentimes is a limiting factor on what the militaries can do, especially what the Ukrainian military can do. So the war on the ground is really a lot more chaotic, a lot more disorganized, and a lot more sort of low level compared to what is presented in the media.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation.
And maybe to take more of an advantage of your NATO NATO experience or NATO military experience, and also having served in Ukraine, how and in what ways would you say that the Ukrainian military and the way it works and it operates is different from the NATO standards? And does that overall, or because I assume that probably that has some advantages, but also many disadvantages as well. Would you say that? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, fundamentally, NATO militaries, for the most part nowadays, are professional militaries, or they're militaries that have a significant professional cadre, whereas the Ukrainian military is a mass army with volunteers or conscripts who are just regular guys taken off the streets. So that creates a very fundamental difference in terms of how the military operates and what you can expect from the people. The standard of training, in the Ukrainian military is far lower than what you would expect from NATO militaries. From what I understand, the Ukrainian military had a certain cadre of highly trained professional troops before the start of the 2022 invasion, but it was the most professional, the most elite units that took the highest losses in the early stages of the war. So nowadays, it's actually very rare to find a Ukrainian soldier who had like serious training before the war and is still alive, is still healthy, and still fighting on the front line. Those kind of people are very rare.
And I've also heard that it's very different between different units and different battalions and different parts of the military. The standards and quality can be extremely different.
I suppose that's true, but even in the so-called elite units nowadays, because of the contingencies of the war, obviously the personnel, they don't have the opportunity to go through the same level of training as they would have had in peacetime before the war. To train a really high-quality military professional requires at least several months of intense, focused, high-quality training, and the Ukrainians just don't have that, even in the elite units. So a lot of the training is kind of abbreviated, and that has a predictable effect on the quality of the troops.
Is that just because there's not enough time to train them properly? Or because I've heard that even now, there's a lot of issues with how Ukrainians are being trained, that, for example, they spend time, even in wartime, they spend time training very formal things like marching and those kind of things that you're trained in a peacetime military, but maybe it doesn't make that much sense to train in wartime. What's your sense? Why is the training still not really up to the standard where it maybe should be?
I think time constraints are definitely an issue. And then there are, of course, a number of other constraints. One of the major constraints is finding the instructors to actually give the training. So, an instructor, a military instructor, is also a very specific kind of professional who needs to have a certain amount of experience and needs to have a certain amount of know-how. And because of the losses, because of the expansion of the Ukrainian military, there probably just aren't enough of these qualified instructors to go around.
What's your sense, maybe since we're talking about it, so it makes sense to look at the different areas or aspects of the military. What's your sense about the officers, since you were an officer as well? Um, how's the quality there, and how's the uh, the level of, or the way the troops are being led, and the way the battlefield and the warfighting is being commanded? How's that?
Well, let me answer that through an anecdote that happened to me. It was in late 2022 when we were involved in a battle in eastern Ukraine. And all in all, it was a pretty rough day. There were about 60 of us in the field, and during the course of about 8 hours, 20 of those 60 sustained some kind of injury, including myself. And when we sustained our first batch of injuries, the evacuation was very quick. There was a vehicle available immediately to evacuate the casualties. Then we sustained another batch of casualties, and at that point, the evacuation took several hours. And from what I can discern, the reason why it took several hours was that there simply was not a vehicle available to carry out the evacuation. So, in other words, the vehicle that had carried out the first evacuation left. It went off somewhere to do something else, and there was no vehicle available to evacuate us. So, in NATO militaries, whenever you go on an operation, you have some kind of plan for evacuating casualties, and that plan usually involves having some kind of vehicle on standby the entire time, precisely through this kind of contingency, to evacuate casualties. And that's a very simple thing. If somebody tells you that once, if they tell you you need to plan to have one vehicle available to evacuate your casualties, you'll know that, and you'll know that for the rest of your military career. But if nobody tells you that one single time, you will only figure it out after the first time that something very bad happens, like happened to us in that battle. So it took one very serious mishap. I don't want to use a more vulgar term to describe it. It took a very serious mishap for our commander to figure out that for all future operations, he needed to have one vehicle on standby for evacuations. And after that, he figured it out. And after that, our evacuations were mostly fairly swift. But my point is that this particular commander, clearly he hadn't gone through a process where somebody had told him that one time in training before there was an actual mishap. Like, dude, for every operation, you need to have a plan for evacuating your casualties, and you need to have a vehicle on standby. He was just learning as he was going along. And there were a lot of similar, maybe less dramatic situations like that in the war, where it was clear to me that the commanders were just learning as they went along. And obviously, I'm sounding very critical. The commanders, for the most part, they did the absolute best they could, and a lot of them, I have nothing but respect for them. But quite simply, they never had anybody explain to them certain simple, fundamental procedures that would have just made the entire process more efficient.
So essentially, when you were talking about the chaos of the war and how it's more akin to 4-year-old children fighting, that chaos is within the command system and structure as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, like the rank and file, like the enlisted ranks, the officers are also, for the most part, just guys off the street that have fairly limited formal training. And, one of my key lessons learned for me from the Ukraine war was that you can't replace training with experience.
What's your opinion on what people sometimes say that the war in Ukraine is basically one big Soviet military fighting a small Soviet military, which means that the Ukrainian army, despite the reforms and despite the transformation, still has a lot of the Soviet mentality and Soviet way of fighting and Soviet way of looking at casualties and so on. To what extent do you think that's true, and to what extent is that kind of thinking and tactics and strategies still a way the things are done in the Ukraine military based on your experience?
Well, I never served in the Soviet military, so I'm not exactly sure what that was like. But no, to be honest, like some of the key points that people bring up when they make this claim, for example, that lower level commanders are not given enough autonomy to carry out their missions, or that commanders don't respect the lives of their troops. I didn't see that. In my units, the commanders were given a significant amount of independent, or scope for independent initiative, and they did for the most part care about their troops. I mean, obviously we could go into specific incidents where we could point out the command did something that I disagree with, et cetera, et cetera. But for the most part, I don't really feel that that's an accurate depiction, at least from my experience. I should also say that in other units it might have been different, but in my experience, the stereotype of the Soviet military was not present in the Ukrainian military.
How have you noticed, or have you noticed, the Ukrainian military transform? And when it comes to a lot of these things that you point out critically, have you noticed that over time, as you are there, and maybe even later, if when you're watching it from externally, have you noticed that these things are improving and changing, or is it a lot of the things that you're critical of? Is it still there and it's not changing that much?
Some things have definitely improved since my first experience in Ukraine. For example, logistics have improved significantly. Some things have not improved. One thing that I noticed the last time I was there compared to the first time was the prevalence of bureaucracy. So it seems to me that paperwork is becoming ever more omnipresent and more time-consuming and more difficult to deal with. There's also the factor of the constant turnover of personnel. So the Ukrainian military still has very high casualty rates, which means that a lot of experienced commanders, a lot of experienced soldiers, quite simply, they get killed or they get injured and they can't continue to fight. They can't continue to apply their experience on the battlefield. And as a corollary of that, a lot of commanders actually get promoted very quickly because, the overall turnover of personnel creates a lot of empty command positions that need to be filled, which means that some of the experienced field commanders get moved to, let's say, headquarters positions, which means that they also are no longer sort of in the field making use of their actual combat experience.
It's quite interesting what you said about the ever increasing amount of bureaucracy, because you would expect that to go down over throughout the course of the war, especially as the war gets maybe even more difficult, and you would expect that things would get more efficient. So it's really interesting to hear that it's the other way.
Yeah, and it's kind of unfortunate I'm not completely opposed to bureaucracy and paperwork. I think it's actually necessary for the efficient functioning of the military machine, but you have to do it right. You have to do it smart. So I'll give you a specific example. In NATO militaries, or in the Slovakian military where I served, we always had this whiteboard in our offices, in our company headquarters, that had a list of all of our vehicles and what each of the vehicles was doing on a given day, and who was riding in each of the vehicles, who was driving it, what kind of equipment they were carrying, etc., etc. The Ukrainians, at least my unit, they didn't have anything like that. So one day I was supposed to go out to position. I was supposed to get a ride in a BTR with the company sergeant major. He was supposed to drive the BTR. He was supposed to pick me up and take me out to the position. So I came out and I saw that he had driven off without me. He had completely forgotten that I was supposed to be in his vehicle on that particular morning. And part of the reason for that is that there was no, whiteboard that would list all the vehicles and everybody that was supposed to be riding in those vehicles. So I would say that kind of whiteboard is an example of good bureaucracy. It makes sure that, a soldier who's supposed to be driving out to a position doesn't get left behind and forgotten. And it ensures that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and where they're supposed to be, etc. On the other hand, you can, of course, do bureaucracy wrong. You can just swamp people with lots of meaningless paperwork that delays processes and that just makes fighting the war more difficult. So it's always a question of each individual process. We have to look at whether it's actually necessary to actually helping the effort, or if it's not, if it's just useless paperwork.
Do you have any thoughts, or what thoughts you have on the very highest level of the military and their or the highest level of command and their efficiency and effectiveness and competency? Because from um it sometimes seems from what you hear from people that there was a lot of admiration for General Zaluzhny when he was the commander in chief, and there's sometimes a lot of criticism for General Syrsky, who's now leading the Ukrainian military. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any thoughts on how, if at all, the military and the way of fighting has changed as these two, as Syrsky replaced Zaluzhny? Do you think it played a role?
Honestly, I don't know. I didn't observe any significant changes that I could definitely trace back to the change in command. I was at the very bottom of the food chain, and from my position looking up, there wasn't a whole lot of difference. That also might have to do with the particular tasks and the particular region where my unit was located. So we were not in one of the regions that was like the primary focus of the high command. So I personally, I didn't notice much difference.
That makes sense. I think it's easy to forget that from a position of a rank and file regular soldier, you're very, very far from the big strategic picture and the things that are happening at the top, which kind of leads me to a bit of a personal question that I just thought of, because I'd be just curious, what's the experience of you having served as an officer and leading people, and then in Ukraine you were, I imagine, at the lowest level in the infantry. How has that changed? How is that experience? And were there times when you wished you could be in an higher position, so you could maybe do things a bit more efficiently or a bit more competently than the people who were there?
I mean, it's always easy to criticize from below. So I'm not claiming that I could necessarily do things better than the people who were actually doing them. That's one thing. And another thing is that I kind of went to Ukraine with this idea that I would just go with the flow, kind of. I didn't go there to change the system. I didn't go there to teach them, to be an instructor, to, show them how it's done properly. Nothing like that. And actually, I know or I've heard of a number of people who went to Ukraine with that kind of mindset. There were people from Western Europe, from the US, who went to Ukraine specifically trying to be instructors, or they went to Ukraine with the specific intention of trying to set up like an elite unit composed of foreigners who like really know how to fight properly. And almost invariably, those people came away very frustrated by their experience in Ukraine. They, in the end, didn't manage to change the system. They didn't manage to show them how it's done. So if you want to go into Ukraine, you kind of have to do what they want you to do. You can't really go in there with the mindset of trying to change it or show them how it's done.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I'd be really curious to hear would be to talk about and take a look at what's your view of the fighting competency of the other side of Russians, because I think sometimes in the media there is, and on social media, there is a tendency to really um, uh, underestimate how capable Russians are, and so even mock their their fighting skills. And I think that that's probably not very smart, because it leads to this um, maybe unrealistic image of the Russians, who often I hear from people who actually go to Ukraine a lot, are a lot more dangerous and a lot more capable than it might seem from Twitter. So what's your view and what's your experience of how capable Russian military actually is, as someone who fought against them?
So when I was working with a drone team, I basically spent the entire time looking at live drone feeds of the battlefield, specifically of Russians moving around the battlefield. And what I saw was...
Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.